Hi, we're recording this on March 1st, 2024, and this is a genuine bulletin by Brass Check. You're going to hear it here first. The governor of Florida has signed a new law. The net result will be the formerly sealed grand jury records of the Jeffrey Epstein case will be released. This hopefully is going to help explain why the first time he was charged and convicted of a minor crime, the federal attorney in Florida said that he was protected, that Epstein was protected, that it was an intelligence operation. Who was running that intelligence operation? Well, that's pretty easy, I think, at this point for people to figure out. Who was Jeffrey Epstein's best buddy? That would be Les Wexler. Who's the guy that gave Epstein the, I guess, 40, 50, $60 million townhouse in New York City that was wired room for room with video and had a control booth? That would be Les Wexler. Who is Wex Lessler? A major, major, major league Zionist. So anyway, here's the clip about the news item that just broke, and followed by that is a documentary, a new documentary we were going to release later in the week, but you're going to see it now, on the connections between Israeli intelligence and Jeffrey Epstein. Not only is Israel a genocidal nation, it's also an enemy of the United States. And this is something that the conservative morons and the Christian Zionist morons, they just don't understand. And that would include the New York Times and all the news outlets and everybody who continues to support this genocide. They just don't get the basic facts. Israel is our enemy, has been our enemy for a long, long time. And the Jeffrey Epstein operation was absolutely an Israeli operation with help from some of our, federal government scumbags. But anyway, here's the news. You will not get this anywhere else. Make sure you stay around for the longer documentary that follows this news clip. Brass Check. Note the date, March 1st, 2024.
Some of Jeffrey Epstein's victims will soon learn why the financier was able to escape federal charges nearly 2 decades ago. Grand jury records are expected to be released, and Governor Ron DeSantis was in town to help get the ball rolling. Local 10's Glenna Milberg is live to explain. Glenna.
Nicole, Florida's newest law never mentions Jeffrey Epstein at all, but it is tailor-made for his victims first and foremost, and for his whole case, which actually started with kind of a sweetheart deal right here at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. Some of the now women witnessed the signing.
I would really just want to know, why was Jeffrey Epstein given such grace and mercy for his inhumane crimes?
What else will decades-old Epstein records reveal?
It would have saved literally hundreds of girls from being put in a position that none of us ever wanted to be put in.
Florida's newest law paves the way to open grand jury records, reveal how and why the late billionaire sex trafficker got away with abusing a network of young girls for himself and possibly other rich and powerful men. Palm Beach, New York, the Virgin Islands.
You had somebody that was very rich and well connected and was able to engineer an outcome that the average citizen would likely never have been able to do.
I pled guilty to solicitation of prostitution.
That was the single charge Epstein got in a sweetheart deal in South Florida in 2010, a deal brokered in part by then Miami U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta, who would go on to be U.S. Labor Secretary until he resigned over this. Prosecutors in New York did what South Florida did not, indicted Epstein, where he died in jail a month later. They called it suicide. Florida's new law is specific, disclosing grand jury testimony only in cases where the subject is deceased, the victims are minors, and a court ordered the testimony part disclosed.
I think it's going to be groundbreaking.
Some of those women, now women, think it'll be groundbreaking too. They today said they want more justice. The law takes effect July 1st. After that, anybody can put in a request to see those grand jury records, and there is absolutely an expectation that more dominoes may be falling. I'm Glenna Milberg, live in Miami tonight, Local 10 News.
I've been working for the state of Israel since before you were born. Who is Jeffrey Epstein, by the way? He was someone who donated so much to Harvard that he was able to open an institute, a transhumanist experimentation institute within the school, I believe, where his buddy Alan Dershowitz would visit him all the time. He donated something like $10 million to Harvard. Jeffrey Epstein would have been, if he were still alive and he hadn't been exposed here and he had still been getting all of these sweetheart deals from federal prosecutors who were told at one point to back off because he's tied to intelligence. Jeffrey Epstein probably would have been in headlines pulling his support out of Harvard over Claudine Gay in Palestine too.
Who do you think Jeffrey Epstein actually was?
I don't know. That's a great question. But I knew that he wasn't who he said he was almost from the instant I started speaking to him. If I had to make a guess, and you're calling for speculation, I would say that he really belonged to what is almost certainly the covert operations community, and that he did not appear to have a prime broker. Nobody seemed to have traded with him. Nobody seems to ask questions around him. So it's very suspicious that we don't, for example, ask for Form 13F. If he was a major hedge fund trader, it's almost impossible to move through the markets without leaving a wake. If you have to speculate, I would say that he probably belonged to covert operations for one or more nations, and that what we're looking at is a very strange, you can shake your head, Alan, but it's also the case that I don't necessarily believe that you stopped associating with him personally at the time of his conviction in Florida, because I think there are pictures of you at the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics socializing with Pinker, Trivers. I don't know. You tell me.
I'm going to have to go back to Alan Dershowitz on that. Alan Dershowitz, how do you respond?
All before that, no, he was not a member of any intelligence agencies. I'm quite sure of that. And he was not a hedge fund guy. In fact, once, you never want to tell humorous stories about Jeffrey Epstein, but he once said to me he wanted to sue a newspaper for defamation. And I said, why did they call you a pedophile? He said, no, they called me a hedge fund guy. He was very upset at being called a hedge fund guy. I don't know what his financial business was, but I can be relatively certain he was not an asset for the Mossad.
Can I just ask why,
Alan
Dershowitz, can I just ask why you're so certain about this? Because it does seem to have been an intelligence gathering operation of some kind, or a compromat situation, or a blackmail situation, something like that, surely.
It's possible, but I never saw any evidence of that. He was a guy from Brooklyn, Coney Island. He was very curious. He wasn't as smart as he thought he was. He didn't know as much about science as he thought he did. But I can tell you that people like Steven Pinker and people like Stephen Gould and people like the president of Harvard thought he asked good questions.
It's very strange to me because he advertised to me that he was a currency trader running a massive hedge fund out of the Lard House in New York on Madison Avenue. And I dropped off documents there. So something is really not gelling. And one of the really interesting things would be to have very extensive discussions to try to figure out who this person is, because the person who presented himself to me was much more like the person who presented himself to Vicky than the person who presented himself to Alan Dershowitz. Now, what I would say is that he had also extensive contacts, apparently, with the Harvard Mathematics Department, both through Benedict Gross and through Martin Nowak. Harvard is all through this story, and as we are learning, Harvard is a very strange place. I was there for about 20 years. It is sort of an extension of the U.S. government in an unacknowledged capacity, and it has the only university to really have the power to effectively change the narrative of academics, in particular very consequential fields. That there's something very peculiar about the way in which we are forgetting a tremendous amount. I would also recommend looking up the name Craig Spence if the suggestion that this sounds like a completely insane idea that he was connected to intelligence. Craig Spence is the antecedent, apparently, of Jeffrey Epstein. It's just very strange that all these things made the papers. There's extensive documentation on the internet. We pretend that we don't know. He was a very strange person from beginning to end. I don't really believe
when you say that he was a strange person, I mean, describe some of the things that were odd in that first meeting, that one meeting you had.
Sure. I don't hear anyone mention the fact that he used an American flag as a tablecloth, making his dinner table look like both a coffin and a trap for you to stain the flag of your own country. He brought in a woman who I think he introduced as an heiress who was braless, that he bounced on his leg at a financial meeting in an attempt to create a distraction. The whole thing was completely surreal from beginning to end. I think one thing that you can learn about this is that he created an incredibly intriguing world. There was no hint. I think this was like 2003, 2004. So this is before he gets into trouble in Florida. And, you know, the whole thing was like a scene out of a movie, and you both wanted to be nowhere close and to know everything about it. And I walked out of there, called my wife and said, I just met a human being who does not appear to be a normal human being. He appears to be a construct. Somebody appears to have constructed something that looks like a financier, but if you scratch the surface, doesn't behave like one, doesn't seem to know a lot about science, although he's very interested in science. Nothing made any sense. Up was down, left was right, black was white.
Jeffrey Epstein was a formidable person to write about. You know, he threatened me. I was pregnant with my children, and he told me that if he didn't like what I wrote, he would have a witch doctor place a curse on my unborn children. He told me he'd found out where I was giving birth. You know, I add, this didn't stop me from reporting the absolute best that I could, and I did debunk some of the claims he made about his own financial professional life. But, you know, the whole thing was, Douglas, a nightmare.
Can I ask you also, Vicky, just quickly, were there any of the names that were released today which surprised you?
No, I didn't know about David Copperfield, and I don't think I'd read about Stephen Hawking. But no, they didn't surprise me. I mean, you know, I've been covering this story for over 2 decades. So I was very familiar with a lot of this. I mean, what it just did was solidify a picture by putting specific names in places. But I think that, unfortunately, the documents still don't show a different part of Jeffrey Epstein's life, which is the manipulation of the powerful people. It was a horrific portrait of this horrific sexual subculture in his homes, but it didn't explain why people like Bill Clinton and massive philanthropists like Leslie Wexner, why they wanted to be around this man. And I'm sure your other guests are going to have a lot of insight into that, because it wasn't because he had a whole group of underage women around him.
One of the things that I find very intriguing is that Jeffrey Epstein appeared to know all sorts of things about me that were not public and seemed to require almost a periscope into my life, in particular scientific things about me that probably flowed through the Harvard department that I was from which I took my PhD. I don't think that you're grasping how strong the circumstantial case is that this person was somehow attached to intelligence and may have benefited from things like state secret privilege and other forms of exotica in the law.
Epstein came across my radar in about 2011, and I ultimately went down to Florida in 2012 and started digging into Epstein. And that's when I acquired his Black Book. And I brought the Black Book back to New York City, and I tried to get publishers to publish it and let me write an article about it. And it took me 3 years before I could get someone to publish it and let me write articles about it. It was, and that was Gawker, which has unfortunately been sued into oblivion at this point. But it's interesting. There was a grand jury in Florida that found that Epstein hadn't molested a single child. And the Palm Beach Police Department, which initiated the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, had 5 victims, underage victims, that they had statements from. And then they had people that corroborated the victims. But they knew of 17 more victims. So the Florida law enforcement and the judiciary knew of 23 Epstein victims at that point. But that grand jury only called 1 Epstein victim. And that special prosecutor, Barry Kushner, skewered her. So that grand jury didn't find Epstein guilty of a single count of child abuse. And the corruption has just cascaded since then.
What you're describing, to I would consider myself to be a sane person, is absolutely mind-bending.
It's mind-bending, and but what's truly unfortunate is that you've got the federal government covering up child trafficking, both in the Franklin scandal and also in the Epstein scandal. The U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida was Alexander Acosta, and that's who was ostensibly supposed to prosecute Epstein. He had a list of 32 Epstein victims. I have that list. And he did not charge Jeffrey Epstein with 1 count of child abuse. And after he had been U.S. attorney, he was nominated to be Trump's labor secretary, and he was being vetted by the Trump administration. And they asked him, why didn't you go after Epstein? And he said, I was told that Epstein was intelligence and that it was above my pay grade and to leave it alone.
Greetings and welcome to Understanding Israel-Palestine Beyond the Walls on 90.1 FM KKFI Kansas City Community Radio. I am this week's producer, Jeremy Roth-Gushel. I speak with Kirby Summers, author of books like Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, and Ghislaine Maxwell, An Unauthorized Biography, and an advocate for victims of sex trafficking, about what the deep political background of espionage not covered in the upcoming Ghislaine Maxwell trial can tell us about the U.S.-Israel special relationship and government by blackmail, hoping to further understanding Israel-Palestine Beyond the Walls. This is Jeremy Roth-Gushel with Understanding Israel-Palestine Beyond the Walls. I'm very pleased to be joined by Kirby Summers, who is an author and an advocate. She has written many, many books of crucial importance, including Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, Jeffrey Epstein Revealed, Ghislaine Maxwell, An Unauthorized Biography. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kirby Summers.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. I've been looking forward to our chat.
Me too. Kirby, I'd like to start out by pointing out that the case of Ghislaine Maxwell, which is coming to a head in New York next month, is usually covered as a salacious, quote-unquote, high society account of gossip in corporate media and even parts of the independent media. But this deeper espionage background of her case and relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the networks that they worked with and for and amongst is related to the background of Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, the infamously known Israel super spy. And this deeper background is something that you cover in your book, Ghislaine Maxwell, An Unauthorized Biography. Can you give us some background in regards to the blackmail network parameters of the Robert Maxwell network, and then more generally his role as Israel super spy and how that relates then to his daughter?
I want to preface this by stating that, as you've noticed, as probably everyone who's interested in the Ghislaine Maxwell case noticed, which you accurately state is scheduled to commence on November 29th. So next month, just a few weeks from today, is a case that mainstream media has not described at any point in time as belonging to an intelligence network, blackmail. They're only really really looking at 4 individual victims and 2 counts of perjury. I think that if people are not really looking at this case on a regular basis, they would be inclined to believe that we're tackling, by we meaning the United States current case against Ghislaine Maxwell, the whole thing. But we're not. The espionage angle of it is not being covered. The blackmail, and you and I had a previous conversation where we discussed the fact that there was also financial crimes that were committed by Epstein that linked back to Michael Milken and Leon Black. None of that other stuff is going to be covered, nor is it covered. With regard to the blackmail operation, I also want to make it very clear that it did not begin with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, that this is the way our government runs. Our government is run by blackmail. Prior to the Epstein case, which we were never supposed to see, this sort of popped up in Palm Beach close to 15, 20 years ago. It was supposed to be squashed. Alexander Acosta made that infamous statement, I was told to back off. Epstein was given a slap on the wrist. It disappeared. Mainstream media at the time described the victims as prostitutes, as drug addicts, made them out to be the perpetrator as opposed to the victim, which is pretty much what we saw during the Franklin scandal.
Kirby, can you explain what the Franklin scandal is? And I just want to highlight that the crucial piece you bring to the table here is an understanding of the reality of deep politics, and that government, both here and abroad, and most especially in terms of this program, the quote-unquote special relationship between the United States and Israel, is not driven by surface-level politics, but driven by what has been titled the deep state, or deep politics, which is defined by the dean of modern deep politics, academic Peter Dale Scott, as the merger or the intersection of the national security apparatus, most especially intelligence networks and espionage, combined in a synergistic fashion with the underground economy and organized crime, and that this is the real governance that we live under, the government of and by blackmail. So can you explain the background of this domestic case of child abuse and how it might be related to this government by blackmail in terms of the Franklin scandal?
Yes, absolutely. There was a very well-known place called Boys Town in Nebraska. And Boys Town was made famous in the very old Hollywood movies. And it was Father Flanagan, and at the end of all of these shows would be send money to Boys Town because this is where we rescue the homeless and the boys that don't have any homes. So I think this began in the 1930s, although we only know about the cases that were brought to the forefront in the 1980s. The Franklin scandal was obtaining boys, but also girls, because at some point it also became a home for girls, and flying them to Washington, D.C., where they would be at these parties. And I'm using air quotes here when I use the term parties. The children would be kept in another part of the home. After the party was over, there would be some people that lingered because they knew that they were going to be, and I hate to use this term, but this is the term that they would use, treats. They would be granted party favors. These party favors came in the form of children that were, prior to the party, provided with drugs like cocaine, any kind of drug. The drugs were passed around, as were the children. The children were horribly abused. You can't call this sex. This is just horrific torture at these parties. And what's interesting is that any of us can actually look for a mainstream media article, and it's called White House Call Boy Ring. And it talks about the fact that these, quote, call boys, come on, you're not of age to give consent. It's a child trafficking network, but that's what they were called, that they were given the opportunity to have access to the White House at midnight with another character named Craig Spence, who I also discuss in my book, Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, because he is very much a character like Jeffrey Epstein. We have many of these characters. We have Jeffrey Epstein, Craig Spence. We have the Franklin scandal, which Craig Spence was connected with. Roy Cohn was also connected to the Franklin scandal, someone who was was very similar to Leslie Wexner. His name was Alan Baer. Alan Baer was a very wealthy and powerful owner of a department store. Not one, but like Wexner had Victoria's Secret. Alan Baer had many department stores and made his fortune like that. He was one of the prominent men who was outed. And if you try to look for anything Alan Baer, B-A-E-R, you'll be hard pressed to find him connected to the Franklin scandal. What would happen with this information is that it allowed for the manipulation of our government. It indicated who's going to take office, what that person who is holding office is going to do. In order to make this case go away, when it actually ended up in front of a judge, the children were basically told, you will have to say that you were lying. And if you don't say you were lying, we're going to put you in jail. One girl refused, Alicia Owen refused, and she in fact was put in jail. She spent 2 years in solitary confinement, another number of years in jail. So a lot of these children who have been caught in these intelligence and politically connected trafficking rings don't get as far as we have gotten with the Jeffrey Epstein case. We are at a rare moment in time. We were not supposed to see this, and the victims who are speaking were never supposed to be heard. So this is a window that we have to take advantage of and learn as much as we can about how government really works.
Leslie Wexner, who you brought up, is crucial to our inquiry here in terms of understanding Israel-Palestine beyond the walls. He is part of a group of Zionist billionaires who are very politically powerful, who have titled themselves the Mega Group. And they include people like Leslie Wexner, the Bronfmans, who sit at the commanding heights of things like Birthright Israel trips, but also Hillel. Leslie Wexner sits on the board of Hillel, an organization alleged to be promoting Jewish life around the country, around the world. It has chapters on university campuses. It also includes the dean of the Birthright Israel program at some point, Michael Steinhardt, whose father was a jewel fence for the Meyer Lansky organized crime syndicate. But then specifically, Leslie Wexner is the long-term patron of Deborah Lipstadt, who is the current guru of the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism and has picked up where former Israeli minister Natan Sharansky left off, collapsing the well-known traditional understanding of what anti-Semitism is as specifically anti-Jewish bias, and then layering on top of it this entire power, geopolitics, state apparatus of Israeli politics. And Deborah Lipstadt has been funded by Wexner and his foundation for many years. And then one last thing with Wexner in terms of understanding Israel-Palestine beyond the walls is that it was Wexner who led the way in hiring Frank Luntz, the notorious GOP guru of spin, basically known as a pollster, one of the proteges of Arthur Finkelstein, who actually helped bring Netanyahu into power as prime minister the first time around in 1996. Wexner hired Luntz in the immediate wake of the launch of the American-Iraq War in 2003 that was very largely driven by the power politics of the Israel lobby, as explained in Chapter 8 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, where Luntz was hired by Wexner to specifically take on the propaganda, the PR inquiry into how to pitch the Iraq War as in American interests and not associated with Israeli interests.
You've done a good job explaining what Wexner has done and his role. But I do want to insert a caveat here. Sometimes, let's say, if you're working undercover, the name of something, in this case, the mega group, will be thrown into the mix to confuse people. So in my book, Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, I devote a whole chapter as to how that word came to be and why it's a screen, a camouflage. But nevertheless, there are a group of people. They're not necessarily, from my understanding, called the mega group, because I know that Meshullam Rickless was part of it, Ira Rickless was part of it, and I never heard them discuss it or refer to it as, quote, the mega group. I believe that was just some smoke to cover up the fact that there was a spy codename Mega inside of Bill Clinton's White House, and that made the news, and it was immediately removed. A year later, suddenly there was an article, I believe it was a Planted article, discussing that Leslie Wexner and Samuel Brofman and Steven Spielberg had a group that would benefit Israel, and it was called Mega, but I think that was just to throw off the scent of Mega the spy, who in fact I'm going to reveal before we are done with this conversation.
Gordon Thomas, who's a co-author of the book Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy, his book Gideon Spies, The Secret History of the Mossad, has a section that talks about the mega intercept during the Clinton administration. High-level Israeli officials in the United States were caught on NSA intercepts saying, we don't use mega for that. This is the same Clinton administration that was shown to have a relation with Epstein and Maxwell many years earlier, and the same Clinton administration where the White House had certain telecommunications contracting done by an Israeli military intelligence firm called Converse Infosys.
It's important to understand that Bill Clinton's White House had 3 Israeli telephone firms that had set up his telephone system. One would have to immediately wonder why there wasn't an American company that would wire the White House. Why were there 3, not 1 even, but 3 that belonged to Israel? And of course, they're going to intercept. There was a letter. Israel wanted the letter. They referred to Mega the spy during this intercepted phone call. Let's contact Mega the spy. And of course, Mega is the code name for this mole in the White House. And the answer was, as you said, that's not what we use Mega for. And so this became an article, I believe in 1998 or 1997, but simultaneous to the conversation that was intercepted, the FBI did commence an investigation. What did Bill Clinton do? Bill Clinton put a kibosh on the investigation. He did not let them investigate to find out who Mega the spy was. A year after that initial article that was then never discussed again, another article sprang up saying, oh, Mega, the group with Leslie Wexner and all of the other names. And since then, we've had another interpretation for the word mega. There's a mega agency that took, for example, the photograph of Ghislaine Maxwell at the In-N-Out Burger. And so the changes of the word mega are now 3. But what we also have to remember is that Robert Maxwell had a very close friend commencing from, I believe their friendship began in the 1950s, Samuel Pissar. Samuel Pissar is a French-born Zionist who was Robert Maxwell's lifelong confidant, and he became John F. Kennedy's advisor back in the 1960s. It brings us to present day because he has a stepson who has been selected by Joe Biden as the Secretary of State, namely Antony Blinken. And Leah Pizar worked for Bill Clinton as well as Antony Blinken, and I believe Leah Pizar is mega. Samuel Pissar was so lifelong Maxwell's confidant that he was the very last person Maxwell had a phone conversation with on November 5th, 1991, before he fell or was pushed off the Lady Glenn yacht. And it was to Samuel Pissar that Betty Maxwell, the grieving widow, although as a side note, they were getting ready to be divorced. So how much of a grieving widow, I don't know. But let's just assume she was the grieving widow, turns to Samuel Pissar, who goes ahead and makes that arrangement for that grand, over-the-top funeral fit for the head of a state, as if he were the prime minister who had just died.
Describe that scene, the funeral of Robert Maxwell, and why it's important to understanding who he actually was, if you would.
During that extravagant funeral in Israel, the people who attended were 6 serving and former heads of the Mossad, as well as former and present prime ministers, including Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and Shimon Peres. Also in attendance was the Soviet emigre Nathan Sharansky, Once they put the body into the grave, the former Prime Minister, Shimon Peres, he steps forward and he looks at Betty Maxwell, and in a very loud and firm voice, after he gives a couple of other words of comfort, says the following thing about Robert Maxwell. He says, he has done more for Israel than can be told today. In Betty Maxwell's book and in Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy by Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, they describe that as a tell. That was the acknowledgement by Israel that, in fact, Maxwell had been a spy for them.
What was the contribution of Robert Maxwell in an espionage fashion to the Israeli state in terms of nuclear secrets and promise software? It's well known now that the cultivation of its own nuclear program was one of the highest aspirations of the early Israeli state leaders, including Ben-Gurion, and even the aforementioned Shimon Peres, who became a prime minister, was one of the fathers of the Israeli nuclear program under what was known as LACOM, the Bureau of Scientific Relations. Ultimately, Shimon Peres then tasked the now infamous billionaire Israeli producer Arnon Milchan, who produced the film JFK by Oliver Stone, to become an agent of Israeli military intelligence, specifically nuclear technology. But Robert Maxwell was an integral part of this specific thread of Israeli espionage around weaponry and most intensely of nuclear technology. Kirby, will you explain the Promise incident in terms of Robert Maxwell and the U.S. nuclear laboratories?
Robert Maxwell was approached by Rafi Eitan and Ariel Sharon and also Meshulam Riklis in 1982. And what they wanted from him was for him to take on the task of selling Promise, which was stolen from Inslaw, a company owned by Bill and Nancy Hamilton. I've had the great fortune of being able to, in fact, interview Bill Hamilton about Promise. Promise was stolen away from Bill and Nancy Hamilton by the Department of State, by the CIA, and the Mossad, who then re-engineered it. It was like a tool that's very much like a Google for internal use. It was able to track people, and it had several functions. It could track people. It could track banking transactions. It could almost track, with a little tweaking of the software, almost anything you wanted it to track. So it was perfect for spying. Robert Maxwell was given this contract to go sell a compromised version of the Promise software to Sandia Laboratories. The way that he got an in was he went and he bribed then Senator John Tower, who was getting ready to retire from Texas, gave him $200,000, put on the record as a consultation fee. Tower turned around and basically said to him that sure, for that consultation fee on an annual basis, he would open the doors to anywhere that Maxwell wanted entry to. So although Maxwell had other avenues for entry into the White House, Tower made it possible for him to walk into Ronald Reagan's White House whenever he wanted. And it was known by William Webster at the time that it was John Tower who allowed Maxwell into Sandia Laboratories. Now, two scientists thought there was something peculiar about this guy, even though this guy walked in there and basically gave a who's who of the people he knew, including Ronald Reagan, and he threw around the names of the powerful men in the world that he knew. So some of them went along with it, but two of the scientists felt uncomfortable. They called the FBI. The FBI began an investigation. Now we have to then travel back into time. The FBI for 37 years, I believe, was run and started by J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover had always been heavily compromised. The CIA has always had a connection with the mob, told them, get me some dirt on Hoover, and they were able to produce incriminating photographs of J. Edgar Hoover having private moments with his second in command, Clyde Tolson, in addition to boys, children from another trafficking ring run by Roy Cohn, where he would cross-dress and take advantage of these minor boys at the Plaza Hotel, which, by the way, would be later owned by Donald Trump, another figure that we see interconnect with Robert Maxwell's world and Jeffrey Epstein's world. The FBI investigation was shuttered. Now, William Webster at the time had the information. What happens when you have somebody of J. Edgar Hoover's stature compromised is that it compromises the entire agency for a very long time. Even though Hoover had been eyeing Maxwell suspiciously since the 1950s and always thought he was a Russian spy, he never did anything when he was in office. And nobody ever did anything afterwards either because it was too much. But to show you how the intelligence agencies work, John Tower in April of 1991 dies in a freak airplane accident. A few months before Robert Maxwell, in November 5th of 1991, falls or was pushed off his yacht. Intelligence agencies tend not to want to leave witnesses, so eventually they get you.
I think you're right to point to the apparent liquidation of John Tower and then Robert Maxwell, one by air, the other by sea, apparently. But I just want to point out that the proof is in the pudding about the compromise of J. Edgar Hoover, the chief of the FBI for decades. As you said, the evidence was there to suspect Robert Maxwell of being an agent of espionage, and Hoover basically does nothing about it. And then also, Hoover is the source of the denial that there was even the existence of something such as organized crime at the same time as people like Meyer Lansky were gathering together these forces and were involved in deep politics, including support of the early and proto-Israeli state, even in terms of trucking and bartering in weapons to that new state.
I've studied this for years beyond the second arrest of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein's world, his connection to Leslie Wexner, his connection to people who intersect with Ghislaine Maxwell's life shows us that the trafficking network is much broader. And what Bill Hamilton, who created Promise, told me in an interview is that it is his understanding that Epstein got a copy of Promise from Robert Maxwell and that it was used to keep track of the victims, I'm going to call them victims, for the intelligence agency. I got that from Bill Hamilton. So if one needs, let's say, Promise, which was the precursor to PRISM, to keep track of these trafficked victims, does that not indicate to you that it is a much bigger operation than what mainstream media has led us to believe?
Very much so. And if this conversation is about government by blackmail, maybe next time we can talk about the technology of blackmail, which is what you're beginning to hint directly at, I would say, is if you're running a compromised network, then how do you keep track of it in relationship to surveillance technology? And that we are all in many ways being inserted into this kind of environment, and the specific technological aspirations of this network do go beyond just the intense desire of Maxwell's handlers inside of the Israeli state to acquire nuclear technology and continue into the contemporary cyber era in terms of the domination of global cyber technology, which would include Ghislaine Maxwell's current husband, Scott Borgerson, the founder of Cargometrics, which he titled as the NSA of freight, of shipping, of Cargometrics, and the heavy investor is Edan Ophir. Edan and Eyal Ophir, the majority owners of the Israel Corporation, which comes out of the early days of the state of Israel and controls certain companies such as Zim Shipping. There's a whole tie-in there in terms of Zim Shipping pulling out of their long-term lease in the World Trade Center in the immediate run-up to the terrorist acts, which is one of the apparent pieces of evidence pointing towards, at the very least, certain high-level Israeli foreknowledge of those terrorist acts. The fact that Ghislaine Maxwell is married to Scott Borgerson and Cargometrics, along with all these other aspects in terms of her sisters and their involvement in Silicon Valley in a very close tie between the United States and Israeli high tech, shows that there's an aspiration here in terms of technology, I would assert, of blackmail too.
You're 100% right. I mean, technology that we have in our United States agencies do come from the Maxwell family. And if we call 911, what do we have? A Flut Barak's Carbine 911, so that we're already past that point. Obviously, mainstream media doesn't cover that, but we're past that point. We have been taken over.
This is Jeremy Rothkushow with Understanding Israel-Palestine and Beyond the Walls. I've been speaking with author and advocate Kirby Summers. Kirby, can you give our audience a sense of where they can find more of your work?
Anyone can find me on Twitter. I try to put as much information on my Twitter, which is at Kirby Summers, Kirb as in boy, Y as in yellow, SOMMERS. My information with links to my podcast are on my website, again, KirbySummers.com, as well as a full list of my books, well over a dozen, a lot of them on Epstein. And I also have an Epstein Project newsletter. And Jeremy, I want to thank you for inviting me on your show. You're very enlightened, and I'm honored to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Kirby, for joining us, and I very much appreciate your work and your time with us today. You've been listening to Understanding Israel-Palestine Beyond the Walls on 90.1 FM KKFI Kansas City Community Radio.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu, because of his views on Israel, would be expelled from Keir Starmer's Labour Party. This is the same Labour Party whose leadership is currently being advised by Lord Peter Mandelson, a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who appears on 10 occasions in Ghislaine Maxwell's Little Black Book. Someone who phoned Jeffrey Epstein when he was in jail on child abuse convictions. What does it say about our politics, our public life, and crucially, our media, that Jeremy Corbyn was criticized more for the way in which he pronounced Jeffrey Epstein's name than scrutiny is being given to the fact that Keir Starmer's leadership is being advised by one of Jeff Epstein's mates? What does that say about the morality of a party that today is suspending and expelling people who share the vision and the specific political views of Archbishop Desmond Tutu?
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.